It is a wild mental image, isn't it? One day a guy is fixing your leaky roof or carving a new door frame for your kitchen, and the next day he's standing in the middle of the town square claiming to be the fulfillment of an ancient prophecy. The reaction of the people in Nazareth wasn't just absurd, it was a mix of shock, skepticism, and eventually, pure outrage. Here's a breakdown of why that transition was so jarring for his neighbors. The small town syndrome. Nazareth was a tiny, insignificant village at the time. Everyone knew everyone else's business. For 30 years, Jesus was known as a tekton, the Greek word used in the Gospels. While we usually translate this as carpenter, it actually referred to a general builder or craftsman who worked with stone, wood, and metal. The familiarity gap, to the locals, Jesus wasn't a mystical figure, he was the guy who probably built their neighbor's table or helped reinforce a structural beam. The family factor, they knew his mother, Mary, and his siblings. In their eyes, he was just Joseph's son. The turning point, the synagogue incident. The most famous absurd reaction happens in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4. Jesus returns to Nazareth, goes to the synagogue, and reads from the scroll of Isaiah. When he finishes, he essentially says, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." The people's escalation: 1. Initial confusion. At first, they were amazed at how well he spoke. 2. Skepticism. Then they started whispering, "Wait, isn't this the carpenter's son? Where did he get this wisdom?" 3. Hostility. When he challenged their lack of faith and suggested that God's blessing might go to outsiders, Gentiles, instead of them, the mood turned dark. 4. The cliff. They didn't just laugh him out of the room, they literally tried to throw him off a cliff. A prophet's problems. This event led to the famous proverb, "A prophet is not without honor except in his own town, among his relatives and in his own home." Why the reaction was so intense? In that culture, claiming to be the Messiah wasn't just a religious statement, it was a political and social bombshell. If you were a local who had watched Jesus grow up, his claim felt like delusions of grandeur. You've been making chairs for 20 years, and now you're the king. Blasphemy. To many, claiming a unique relationship with God was a crime punishable by death. It's hard for people to accept that greatness can come from someone they've seen doing ordinary work. Archaeology gives us a fascinating blue-collar look at Jesus that makes the townspeople's reaction even more understandable. If you lived in Nazareth back then, you didn't just know Jesus as a guy from the synagogue, you probably had his handiwork in your living room. Here is what the dirt and stones of Nazareth tell us about his 9 to 5 life. 1. He was more of a stonemason than a carpenter. While we traditionally call him a carpenter, the Greek word used in the Gospels is tekton. In 1st century Galilee, wood was expensive and scarce, mostly used for small tools, yokes, or roof beams. Stone, however, was everywhere. The job, he likely spent his days quarrying limestone, squaring off massive blocks with a shahuta, a traditional stone axe, and hauling them to job sites. The physicality, this wasn't delicate bench work. It was heavy, back-breaking labor. By age 30, Jesus would have likely been physically imposing, broad-shouldered and calloused from decades of lifting rocks. 2. The house-to-house handyman. Nazareth was tiny. Archaeologists estimate it was only about 4 acres with roughly 50 houses. Roof specialist. 1st century homes had flat roofs made of branches and mud. They leaked every winter. Jesus would have been the guy you called to help remud and roll the roof with a heavy stone roller to keep it waterproof. The Sisters of Nazareth house excavations have revealed 1st century homes in Nazareth that were partially rock-hewn, cut directly into the hillside. He wouldn't just build a house, he would literally carve it out of the earth. 3. The Sepphoris Commute. Just a 3-mile walk from Nazareth was Sepphoris, a massive Roman boomtown being built by Herod Antipas during Jesus' working years. It's highly likely Jesus and Joseph commuted there for work. In Sepphoris, he would have worked on sophisticated Roman architecture, theaters, and villas. This gave him a worldview far beyond his tiny village, which might be why his teaching sounded so educated and different to the locals when he returned. Why his claim felt absurd. Imagine the scene: you are standing in a house where the door frame is slightly crooked because that Jesus kid helped his dad install it 20 years ago. You remember him sweating in the sun, covered in white limestone dust, haggling over the price of a stone lintel. Then, that same guy stands up and says he is the Messiah.To the locals. The Messiah was supposed to be a cloud-riding warrior or a golden-robed king, not the guy who fixed your leaky roof last Tuesday. Their reaction wasn't just religious, it was the ultimate "I knew you when you were a toddler" skepticism. Fun fact, when Jesus talked about the stone the builders rejected or building a house on the rock, he wasn't just using pretty metaphors. He was talking shop. He knew exactly which stones were brittle and which ones could hold the weight of a building. To understand Jesus' workday, you have to picture someone who was less like a modern furniture maker and more like a rugged, all-purpose construction worker. His life was defined by the rhythm of the sun, the weight of stone, and the dust of the road. Here is what a typical Tuesday for Jesus of Nazareth likely looked like around the year 20 AD. 1. The morning commute, the 3-mile trek. Work started at sunrise. If there wasn't a local repair in Nazareth, he likely headed to Sepphoris, the jewel of Galilee. The walk, it was about an hour's walk over hilly terrain. He wouldn't have walked empty-handed, he likely carried a heavy leather tool bag or a wooden yoke across his shoulders to balance his equipment. The atmosphere, the road would be crowded with other laborers, farmers, and Roman soldiers. This is where he would have seen the real world, tax collectors at the gates and the disparity between the rich city dwellers and the poor villagers. 2. The tool bag, low-tech precision. He didn't have power tools, but the tools he used were remarkably effective. Precision was key because stone is unforgiving. Tool and its purpose, shahuta, a heavy stone-cutting axe used to shape blocks. Plumb line, a weight on a string to ensure walls were perfectly vertical. Bow saw, for cutting timber, very labor-intensive. Mallet and chisel, for fine detail work on stone lintels or wooden joints. Compass and rule, for geometric layouts, essential for arches. 3. The midday grind, dust and sweat. The work was loud and physically draining. The projects, he might be helping to build a mikveh, ritual bath, carving out a wine press from solid bedrock, or fitting a heavy stone rolling door for a tomb. The materials, he would be covered in a fine white powder from the limestone. In the summer, the Galilean sun would be brutal, making the stone almost too hot to touch by noon. The interaction, as a tekton, he had to negotiate contracts. He wasn't just a laborer, he was a small business owner. He had to deal with grumpy homeowners, haggle over the price of wood, and ensure the work met the building standards of the day. 4. The lunch break, simple and portable. There were no lunch trucks. He would have carried his food in a small cloth bag, scrip. The menu, coarse barley bread, cheaper than wheat, a handful of salted olives, maybe a piece of dried fish from the Sea of Galilee, and a few dates or a fig for energy. The drink, water carried in a goatskin flask, or perhaps sour wine, vinegar mixed with water, which was the standard thirst quencher for laborers. The hidden influence on his teaching. When you look at his workday, his later parables make so much more sense. He didn't use flowery religious language, he used the language of a guy who worked with his hands. He talked about the speck versus the plank in your eye, a shop safety. He talked about calculating the cost before building a tower, business management. He talked about yokes being easy, a well-carved wooden yoke wouldn't gall the oxen's neck. He knew this because he likely carved them. When Jesus transitioned from his workbench to the pulpit, he didn't start speaking like a philosopher trained in Athens or a priest from the temple in Jerusalem. He spoke like a tradesman. His office for 15+ years was the construction site, and that experience is woven into the very fabric of his parables. Here is how his professional life as a tekton, builder, shaped his famous messages. 1. The lazy yoke, product quality control. In one of his most famous invitations, he says, "For my yoke is easy and my burden is light," Matthew 11 verse 30. The builder's perspective, a poorly carved wooden yoke would gall an ox's neck, causing sores and making the animal refuse to work. The detail, a good builder would spend hours sanding the wood and measuring the fit to ensure the weight was distributed perfectly. When Jesus said his yoke was easy, he was using a professional term for well-fitted. 2. The speck and the plank, workshop humor. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? Matthew 7 verse 3. The builder's perspective. This is classic shop talk. Anyone who has worked in a wood or stone shop knows the danger of flying debris. The wit is using a hilarious, hyperbolic image, a guy walking around with a massive 10-foot ceiling beam sticking out of his face while trying to pick a tiny splinter out of someone else. It's the kind of joke a foreman would tell on a job site. 3. The foundation, structural integrity. He told a story about two men, one who built on sand and one who built on rock, Matthew 7 verses 24 to 27. The builder's perspective. In the hilly terrain of Galilee, the topsoil is thin. During the dry season, the sandy wadis, dry riverbeds, look like great flat places to build. The engineering. A professional builder knows that when the winter rains come, those tough flat spots turn into raging rivers. Jesus wasn't just giving moral advice, he was giving an engineering warning he had likely seen play out in real life. For counting the cost, project management. Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? Luke 14 verse 28. The builder's perspective. Jesus likely had to bid on jobs. He knew the embarrassment of a half-finished project. The social context. In a small town like Nazareth, an unfinished building was a permanent monument to a builder's, or owner's, failure. He knew the business side of construction, permits, materials, and labor costs. 5. The cornerstone, the master mason's choice. He quotes the Psalms saying, "The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone," Matthew 21 verse 42. The builder's perspective. When sorting through a quarry, masons would look for a perfect stone, one with 90-degree angles that could bear the weight of two walls meeting. The insight. Many stones looked good but had hidden flaws, cracks, that would cause them to shatter under pressure. Jesus understood the eye of a master mason, seeing value in a rock that others thought was just a piece of rubble. The final absurdity. The people of Nazareth were confused because they expected a Messiah to come from a royal palace. Instead, they got a man who used the vocabulary of sawdust, plumb lines, stone rollers, and calloused hands. To them, it was absurd that the architect of the universe would spend his life fixing broken doors. To Jesus, it was the perfect metaphor for what he came to do, restore what was broken.To understand why the people of Nazareth found Jesus absurd. You have to look at the massive culture clash happening right in his backyard. While Nazareth was a tiny, conservative Jewish village of farmers and laborers, Sepphoris, just a 60-minute walk away, was a glittering, Greco-Roman metropolis. As a tekton, Jesus likely spent his formative working years, ages 12 to 30, building a city that represented everything his neighbors either envied or hated. 1. The hypocrite and the theater. One of Jesus' favorite words was hypocrite. In modern English, it means a moral fake, but in the 1st century, hypocrites was a technical term for a stage actor. The Sepphoris connection. Archaeologists have excavated a massive 4,500-seat Roman theater in Sepphoris. The work. As a builder, Jesus may have helped stone cut the very tiers where these actors performed. The teaching. When he told his followers not to be like the hypocrites who pray on street corners to be seen, he was using a vivid theatrical metaphor. He was essentially saying, don't put on a costume and a mask for God like the actors we see over in the city. 2. The city on a hill. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus famously says, a city set on a hill cannot be hidden, Matthew 5 verse 14. The sight line, Sepphoris was literally built on a high hill overlooking the valley where Nazareth sat today. At night, its oil lamps and white limestone buildings would have glowed like a beacon. The irony, to a poor laborer in Nazareth, that city on a hill represented Roman taxes, luxury, and oppression. Jesus flipped the script. He told his blue-collar followers that they, and not the elite Romans in their marble villas, were the true light of the world. 3. Greek influence versus village tradition. Working in Sepphoris meant Jesus wasn't just Jesus the villager. He was Jesus the cosmopolitan worker. Language. While he spoke Aramaic at home, he likely learned enough Greek to negotiate with Roman contractors and Greek-speaking foremen. Architecture. He saw mosaics, Corinthian columns, and advanced aqueducts. Why the Nazareth locals were triggered. When Jesus came back to the Nazareth synagogue, the locals weren't just judging his religious claims, they were judging his class. Imagine a local handyman who leaves a small town to work on a massive, high-tech skyscraper project in the big city. When he comes back, he's talking about the kingdom of God using sophisticated metaphors and challenging the local elders. The local reaction was likely, who does he think he is? He went off to work for the Romans in Sepphoris, picked up some city ideas, and now he's coming back here to tell us how to live? He's just the guy who fixed my roof. The stumbling block of the ordinary. The absurdity for the people of Nazareth was the gap between the ordinary, the guy with stone dust in his hair, and the extraordinary, the Son of God. They couldn't reconcile the man who knew the price of a bushel of grain with the man claiming to be the bread of life. The lost years, roughly aged 12 to 30, are the silent stretch where Jesus went from being a precocious boy in the temple to a seasoned man ready to change the world. While the Gospels skip this era, history and archaeology fill in the blanks with a life of grit, travel, and profound observation. Here is what was likely happening during those 18 missing years. 1. The death of Joseph, the family breadwinner. In the Gospel accounts, Joseph disappears from the story after Jesus is 12 years old. By the time Jesus starts his ministry at 30, only his mother Mary is mentioned. The responsibility, as the eldest son, Jesus would have likely become the head of the household. The burden, in first-century Jewish culture, this meant he was responsible for the financial survival of his mother and his siblings, James, Joses, Judas, Simon, and his sisters. The result, his lost years weren't spent in a cave meditating, they were spent in the marketplace, negotiating contracts, and working hard to keep his family fed. He knew the weight of a mortgage, the stress of a slow work season, and the pressure of being a provider. 2. The multilingual laborer living in Galilee during the lost years meant Jesus was likely trilingual. Aramaic, his heart language spoken at home and in the village. Hebrew, the language of the Torah he studied in the Nazareth synagogue. Greek, the language of business. To get a construction contract in Sepphoris or to buy quality timber from a Phoenician merchant, he had to speak Greek. 3. The University of the Road, Nazareth sat near the Via Maris, Way of the Sea, one of the most important trade routes in the ancient world. The exposure, during his working years, Jesus would have seen caravans from Egypt, silk merchants from the East, and Roman officials from Rome. The observation, this is likely where he gathered the data for his later parables. He watched how masters treated their servants, how merchants haggled over pearls, and how farmers struggled with rocky soil. He wasn't just working, he was studying humanity. 4. The transition, from stone to spirit. As he approached 30, the lost years came to a boiling point. The internal shift, he had mastered the physical world, stone, wood, iron. He had fulfilled his family obligations. The catalyst, news reached Nazareth about a wild man in the desert, his cousin, John the Baptist. The exit, imagine the scene in the Nazareth workshop. He puts down his heavy stone-cutting axe, brushes the limestone dust off his tunic for the last time, and tells his brothers, it's time. The absurdity of the ex-handyman. When he returned to Nazareth after his baptism, he wasn't Jesus the builder anymore. He was Jesus the rabbi. The townspeople's absurd reaction was essentially a refusal to accept his transformation. They wanted to keep him in the box of the lost years. To them, he was still the guy who owed them a repaired chair or a finished wall. The irony of the lost years, those years weren't lost at all. They were the years he spent becoming one of us, experiencing the exact same daily grind, taxes, and physical exhaustion that his future followers felt every day. The shift from a settled laborer to a wandering teacher was a 180-degree turn. It wasn't just a career change, it was a total abandonment of the social safety net he had built over 15 years. Here is how his daily life transformed once he hit that milestone age of 30. The professional shift, builder versus rabbi feature, the builder, age 15 to 30, location, fixed, Nazareth Sepphoris, primary tool, plumb line, saw, stone axe daily goal, structural integrity, houses. Income, daily wage, denarius, social circle, fellow tradesman, client's end of day, returning to his mother's house feature, the rabbi, age 30 to 33. Location, nomadic, Galilee, Judea, Samaria, primary tool, the spoken word, parables. Daily goal, spiritual integrity, hearts, income, reliance on hospitality, donation, social circle, fishermen, tax collectors, outcasts, end of day, no place to lay his head. 1. From making to walking. As a builder, Jesus' life was stationary. He had a workshop, a reputation, and a physical footprint. The change, at 30, he became a peripatetic teacher, one who teaches while walking. The physical toll, his years of heavy lifting prepared him for this. Walking from the Sea of Galilee up to Jerusalem is a brutal, uphill climb, a 2,500-foot elevation gain. Most people would be exhausted. A man who had spent 15 years hauling limestone blocks was physically primed for the trek. 2. The shift in authority. In the workshop, Jesus' authority came from his skill. If the table was level, he was right. The absurdity, when he began his ministry, he spoke as one who had authority, and not as their religious scholars, Matthew 7 verse 29. The reaction, the locals in Nazareth were used to rabbis who quoted other famous rabbis. Jesus quoted the law and then added, "But I tell you." To his old neighbors, this was the height of arrogance. It's like your local plumber suddenly walking into a courtroom and telling the judge how to interpret the Constitution. 3. From creating walls to breaking barriers. A builder's job is to create boundaries, walls that separate the inside from the outside. The irony, as a rabbi, Jesus did the opposite. He sat with tax collectors, the enemies of the builders, and ate with unclean people. The conflict, his old co-workers likely saw this as a betrayal of their social class. In a small town, fitting in is the first rule of survival. By breaking these social walls, Jesus became a failed member of the community in their eyes. 4. The new workshop instead of a stone quarry, his materials became the crowds. The management style, he chose 12 apprentices, disciples. Just as he would have taught a younger brother how to square a stone, he now spent every waking hour teaching these men how to build the movement. Why 30? Jewish culture, 30 was the age of physical and mental maturity. It was the age when priests began their service in the temple. By waiting until 30, Jesus honored the natural order of his culture, but it also meant he had nearly 2 decades of real-world experience under his belt. He didn't come out of a vacuum, he came out of the dust. The townspeople saw a man who had quit his job. Jesus saw a man who had finally started his real work. The final rejection in Nazareth is one of the most poignant moments in the Gospels. It wasn't just a theological debate, it was the ultimate breakup between Jesus and the town that raised him. After he became famous in the region, he returned home one last time, and the results were even more absurd and hostile than before. 1. The final visit, the prophet without honor. When Jesus returned to Nazareth, recorded in Mark 6 and Matthew 13, he brought his disciples with him. He wasn't the lone handyman anymore, he was a leader with a following. The reaction, the townspeople were astonished, but not in a good way. They began a public inventory of his family. Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary and brother of James and Joses and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? The result, they took offense at him. The Greek word is iskandalizonto, they were literally scandalized or tripped up by him. The consequence, the Bible says he could do no mighty works there except healing a few sick people, because of their unbelief. He was amazed at their lack of faith. The very people who should have known his character best were the ones who trusted him the least. 2. The family intervention, he is out of his mind. Before his brothers became his followers, they were his biggest critics. At one point, his own family actually went to seize him, Mark 3 verse 21. The reason, they heard he was attracting such huge crowds that he wasn't even eating. They didn't think he was the Messiah, they thought he was having a mental breakdown. The ridicule, his brothers once mockingly told him to go to Judea to show off his works, essentially calling him a fake, to John 7 verses 3 to 5. 3. What happened to them afterward? The most incredible part of this absurd story is what happened after the crucifixion. The very brothers who thought he was out of his mind became the leaders of his movement. Family member. What happened to them? Mary, mother, stayed with the disciples, was present at the cross and in the upper room. James, brother, became the leader of the Jerusalem church. He wrote the book of James and was eventually martyred for his faith. Judas, brother, became a missionary and wrote the book of Jude in the New Testament. Sisters, history loses track of them, but they remained in Nazareth and likely joined the early church community. Why did they change their minds? Most historians and theologians point to one event, the resurrection. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15 verse 7 that Jesus appeared specifically to James. Imagine being James. You spent 30 years sharing a room with him, 3 years thinking he was crazy, and then suddenly, he stands before you after being publicly executed. That is the moment the absurdity turned into conviction. The Nazareth archaeological legacy. Today, you can visit Nazareth and see the synagogue church, which is built over the traditional site of that first-century synagogue where they tried to throw him off the cliff. It remains a small, humble stone structure, a permanent reminder of the day the town's local builder became their greatest scandal.